Cartels are feeling the pinch of the interagency operations that are impacting their day-to-day.
Jefferson, Georgia, minutes before sunrise. At 4:37 a.m., the stillness of a quiet suburban street was broken by the deep mechanical rumble of armored engines rolling in with purpose. This was not a loose street crew moving product opportunistically. It operated like a supply unit, compartmentalized roles, centralized coordination, strategic positioning hundreds of miles from the border. From a federal standpoint, that distinction shifted the scale of the threat. Agencies including the FBI and ICE began viewing the operation not as isolated drug activity, but as a foreign criminal organization embedding logistical infrastructure inside American communities, exploiting anonymity, leveraging mobility, using quiet suburbs as distribution anchors. The terminology changed internally. This was not chaos. It was structured logistics warfare, pressure applied through supply chains rather than open confrontation. After months of surveillance, wire analysis, financial tracing, and informant cooperation, agents believed they understood the scope of what they were about to dismantle. They expected narcotics. They did not expect what was waiting behind that door. They expected money. What they did not expect was the level of militarization concealed behind drywall and suburban landscaping. As the breach moved from perimeter control to interior clearance, something shifted inside federal command. The data they had gathered for months suddenly felt incomplete. The evidence waiting inside that structure was about to push the case beyond every operational model they had prepared for. When the front door collapsed inward, agents crossed a threshold that no longer resembled a family home. The air hit first, a sharp chemical sting mixed with the metallic trace of gun oil, a combination federal tactical teams are trained to recognize instantly. It was not the scent of short-term storage. It was the smell of sustained production, preparation, and readiness. Repeatedly, intermediaries connected back to figures associated with the Sinaloa cartel. This was not routine patrol traffic. It was a synchronized arrival. Within seconds, a flash bang detonated at the front entrance of a modest single-family home. The blast cracked through the silence like a controlled explosion, bouncing off garages and brick facades. Porch lights flicked on. Curtains shifted. Neighbors stepped toward windows, confused, disoriented. By then, it was already too late. Armored Bearcat vehicles had sealed the street from both ends, locking the neighborhood inside a perimeter that felt more like a combat zone than a small Georgia town. Red and blue lights flooded the pavement. Tactical teams advanced through drifting smoke, voices steady, commands precise. Every movement had been rehearsed, every second calculated. This was not a rushed reaction. It was the execution phase of a long-running federal investigation. According to charging documents later released by federal authorities, the house was not simply a residence. It functioned as a logistics hub, connected to a transnational criminal network. Inside, agents recovered fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, significant amounts of cash, and something investigators did not expect to find in suburban America: a working military-style grenade launcher. The seizure was part of a broader, coordinated takedown spanning multiple cities and involving more than a dozen federal entities. Internally, it marked the opening strike of Operation Take Back America, a campaign designed to dismantle foreign criminal structures operating inside U.S. communities. And here is what makes this case deeply unsettling. No one on that street had any idea what was operating next door. For months, life continued as usual. Cars parked in driveways, packages delivered to front steps, students driving in and out of nearby college towns. Nothing about Jefferson or neighboring Athens and Atlanta suggested it was becoming a distribution corridor. But behind the calm exterior, warning signs were building. Hospitals and law enforcement agencies across Georgia were reporting a sharp increase in overdose cases tied to fentanyl. Many victims insisted they believed they had taken legitimate prescription pills. Investigators later identified a surge of counterfeit tablets, manufactured to resemble common painkillers but pressed with unpredictable, often lethal doses of fentanyl. National data had already confirmed the broader trend. Fentanyl had become the leading cause of overdose deaths among young Americans. Georgia was not immune. It was becoming a bridge. Financial analysts working alongside federal task forces began noticing irregular money flows. Small businesses with minimal visible activity were processing steady streams of wire transfers. Funds moved between Georgia, Texas, California, and offshore accounts with no clear commercial justification. The transactions were not flashy. They were disciplined, consistent, structured. That consistency was the red flag. Court filings. later revealed that investigators began mapping communication patterns, cash movements, and supply chains that extended far beyond state lines. The network was not improvising. It was organized. Under the harsh white beams of mounted lights, the illusion of domestic normalcy disappeared. The kitchen was not a kitchen. The table was buried beneath tightly compressed bricks of cocaine and methamphetamine, stacked with deliberate spacing. Not rushed concealment, but organized inventory. Nearby, loose fentanyl powder had scattered across the floor during the breach, its fine particles catching the light in a way that forced even experienced agents to slow their movements. According to federal seizure reports later cited by prosecutors, the volume recovered inside that single residence represented a lethal distribution capacity far beyond neighborhood-level sales. This was supply chain material. Deeper inside the house, sealed plastic containers revealed the next layer, hundreds of thousands of counterfeit pills, pressed to mirror legitimate prescription medications in shape, color, and imprint. Precision replicas, not crude imitations, engineered deception. Public health officials have repeatedly warned that counterfeit tablets are among the primary drivers of fentanyl-related overdose deaths among younger Americans. In that room, those warnings were no longer abstract statistics. They were physical inventory. Then the tone shifted again. In a rear room, behind what appeared to be standard storage shelving, agents uncovered an arsenal no residential address should ever contain. 26 firearms were positioned throughout the property. Multiple AR-15-style rifles, handguns, loaded magazines, tactical gear staged for rapid access. But what stopped the search team cold was hidden beneath a reinforced workbench, a functioning military-style grenade launcher. Its serial number had been deliberately ground away, a hallmark of weapons diverted through illicit international channels. Court documents would later confirm the device was operational, not symbolic, not decorative, operational. For investigators from the FBI and ICE, the erased markings were more than concealment. They were evidence of structured procurement, weapons acquired, sanitized, and positioned with intent. When analysts later cross-referenced the interior layout with seized communications, the pattern became undeniable. This house was not simply storing narcotics. It was arming, supplying, and defending a distribution network connected to the Sinaloa cartel. By the time the final room was cleared, the classification changed. This was not a stash house waiting quietly for pickup. It was a fortified logistics node, a forward operating base embedded inside an American suburb. The drugs were not sitting idle. The weapons were not randomly accumulated. The site had been configured for sustained operation and, if necessary, confrontation. As agents secured the structure, another layer of the network began to surface. Not in safes, not in cash bundles. On the walls, taped above workstations and door frames were hand-drawn maps. Routes traced from northern Mexico through Texas, across the southeast, terminating in Georgia. Interstate corridors, secondary highways, rest stops, port access points, distribution pivots marked in coded symbols. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like scattered sketches. To federal investigators, it was infrastructure. It was not just a sketch. It was a working blueprint, a live schematic of a supply chain stretching thousands of miles, engineered to move product quietly, steadily, and without drawing attention inside American communities. Throughout the house, small details reinforced that reality. Sticky notes marked with coded abbreviations, notebooks filled with numbers that seemed meaningless until analysts aligned them with shipping dates and layered financial transfers. Burner phones were charging in clusters, each one labeled or color-coded to indicate a specific operational role. Federal affidavits later revealed that these devices were rotated constantly, sometimes weekly, minimizing exposure and disrupting surveillance tracking. What initially appeared disorganized quickly revealed disciplined structure. Nothing inside that house was accidental. Every object supported a function. Every individual had a defined responsibility. As agents reconstructed the workflow, the hierarchy became clear. Couriers handled transportation, others controlled storage. Separate operators processed payments. A smaller inner circle coordinated timing, security, and communication. Investigators later described the structure as resembling a logistics unit rather than a street-level crew. There was redundancy built into each layer. Backup contacts, alternate routes, financial buffers. This mirrored long-standing intelligence assessments tied to the Sinaloa cartel, an organization U.S. authorities have repeatedly characterized as highly organized, adaptive, and strategically compartmentalized. The financial trail confirmed the same pattern. Cash seized at the Jefferson location represented only a fraction of the network's revenue stream. Federal financial analysis showed proceeds moving through small businesses that appeared legitimate, alongside shell companies that existed only on paper. Funds were routed across multiple states, layered through digital transfers, then redirected toward foreign intermediaries. According to public statements from the U.S. Department of Justice, this type of financial layering is a classic concealment strategy, fragmenting ownership, slowing detection, and buying time for relocation if a node collapses. From the perspective of agencies such as the FBI and ICE, the implications extended far beyond narcotics. What they were confronting was not just trafficking, it was systemic infiltration. The network exploited rental markets, small commercial fronts, digital banking systems, and transient populations to embed itself invisibly. It relied on normalcy, routine, the assumption that organized violence remained somewhere distant. That is why officials increasingly describe these operations not only as criminal enterprises, but as structured incursions into economic and social infrastructure. As analysts decrypted messages pulled from seized phones and cross-referenced them with recovered documents, a final conclusion emerged. The Jefferson House was never intended to stand alone. It was one interchangeable node within a broader, resilient system designed to absorb losses. If one site fell, another would compensate. The raid had struck hard, but it had not dismantled the architecture. Evidence pointed in a single direction. This breach was not the end. It was the opening move against a network engineered for survival. As dawn approached Georgia, the scope widened. What began as a single tactical entry escalated into a synchronized federal operation executed across multiple cities. Teams from 13 federal agencies moved simultaneously under a coordinated plan designed to eliminate the network's primary advantage: communication speed. Doors were breached within minutes of each other. In Jefferson, Athens, and Atlanta, no warning window, no time for couriers to disperse, no opportunity for digital trails to be wiped clean. From the outside, the target locations looked ordinary: student rentals, modest homes, low-profile properties embedded in quiet neighborhoods. Inside, the scale told a different story. Federal prosecutors later confirmed the seizure of hundreds of thousands of counterfeit pills, bulk quantities of fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine, along with large cash holdings and detailed distribution logs. When analysts aggregated the results across 12 coordinated targets, the estimated street value approached $900,000, a figure representing only a visible fraction of a much larger operational flow. The decisive factor was timing. Because each location was hit simultaneously, the network's internal coordination collapsed in real time. Burner phones rang unanswered, messages stalled mid-transmission. Couriers arrived to find locked doors and police tape already in place. Several suspects attempted to destroy devices. Others attempted to flee. Exit routes had already been sealed. The network had been designed for speed. On that morning, speed became its vulnerability. Coordination, once its greatest strength, turned into its most critical failure. One federal agent later described the operation as urban combat without gunfire. From the outside, the streets remained still. Neighbors watched quietly from behind blinds and partially open doors. But inside the targeted properties, teams moved with battlefield discipline. Rooms were cleared methodically. Evidence was secured immediately. Suspects were detained under the assumption that heavy weapons could be present at any moment. That level of caution proved justified. Firearms recovered across multiple locations confirmed that the Jefferson House was not an isolated case. It was part of a broader pattern of militarization. From the perspective of agencies such as the FBI and ICE, the statewide sweep marked a strategic turning point. Transnational criminal networks were no longer operating on the periphery. They were embedding themselves deep inside American cities, using ordinary infrastructure to move extraordinary volumes of lethal narcotics. Public statements from the U.S. Department of Justice emphasized that the scale and simultaneity of the operation were deliberate. Piecemeal arrests would have allowed the network to adjust, relocate, and rebuild. This required overwhelming coordination to fracture communication before it could react. By late morning, 17 suspects were in federal custody. Many faced serious conspiracy charges carrying substantial prison sentences. For local communities, the sight of federal convoys, armored vehicles, and sealed evidence trucks was jarring. For investigators, it was confirmation that months of surveillance, financial analysis, and intelligence coordination had converged at the right moment. But the aftermath revealed something more complex. As digital devices were cataloged and forensic teams began extracting data, signs of rapid adaptation surfaced almost immediately. Communication threads outside the target zones shifted. Accounts went dark. Message traffic rerouted through newly activated devices. Secondary contacts appeared to assume control. The network had absorbed the shock and begun adjusting. Inside federal command centers, that detail mattered as much as the seizures. The strike had disrupted the system, but it had not blinded it. By the time the final evidence was logged, response patterns were already forming beyond Georgia. Court records later showed that several of the 17 individuals taken into custody were not first-time offenders. Some had prior convictions related to narcotics or weapons offenses. They had returned to the same operational environment with tighter discipline and greater access to firepower. For investigators, this pattern reinforced a critical assessment. The network was built on continuity, replacement, experience. It was designed to regenerate. Yet the most alarming metric was not the arrest total. It was the fentanyl. According to seizure data cited by federal prosecutors and supported by public health reporting, the volume recovered during the Georgia raids was sufficient to produce hundreds of thousands of potentially lethal doses. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has repeatedly warned that only a few milligrams can be fatal. Every seized package represented doses that would never reach a consumer. From a national security perspective, that reality elevated the case beyond standard criminal prosecution. It became a public safety emergency with broader strategic implications. As analysts from the FBI and ICE reviewed the combined evidence, a larger pattern came into focus. What they were confronting was not a single trafficking corridor. It was a replicable model. Investigators described it as a system of satellite bases, compact but fortified logistics hubs positioned far from the border, embedded inside ordinary neighborhoods. These nodes allowed criminal organizations to store product, process payments, coordinate distribution, and recover quickly if one site was compromised. They were not hiding in remote terrain. They were operating in plain sight. By shifting the battlefield inward, the discovery of heavy weapons pushed the assessment even further. The recovery of assault-style rifles, tactical equipment, and a functioning grenade launcher was not symbolic. It signaled operational readiness. Federal briefings later made clear that this level of armament was not about intimidation alone. It was about preparation. These cells were positioned to defend product, cash flow, and territory with decisive force if necessary. That reality forced agencies to reassess long-held assumptions about where cartel-linked violence could surface and how rapidly it could escalate inside the United States. From Washington's perspective, the tone surrounding the case adjusted accordingly. Officials avoided sensational language, but the strategic message was unmistakable. This was not simply reactive law enforcement. It was coordinated domestic defense against a foreign criminal enterprise exploiting American infrastructure. The involvement of 13 federal agencies, the synchronized timing of raids, and the focus on dismantling entire logistical systems rather than isolated actors reflected that shift. Yet the operation also revealed a harder truth. Removing one cell does not dismantle the architecture that produced it. Cartel networks are engineered for resilience. They absorb losses, they replace personnel, they reroute supply chains. Digital evidence recovered in Georgia indicated communication channels and financial corridors extending well beyond the locations targeted that morning. Even as one branch was cut, others remained active. That is the element that remains after headlines fade. The Georgia raids delivered a decisive disruption. Dangerous individuals were detained, weapons were removed, large quantities of narcotics were seized before reaching American communities. But the evidence reinforced what federal agencies have warned for years. These networks are structured to survive impact. By the time the final evidence truck departed Jefferson, the significance of the operation had expanded far beyond a single address. What began as a pre-dawn breach of a quiet suburban home concluded with the exposure of a transnational criminal system operating deep within U.S. territory. The drugs, the cash, and the weapons were alarming. The scale and structure behind them were even more consequential. This was not an isolated crime scene. It was proof of a functioning logistics node embedded inside an American neighborhood, sustained by routine activity and the assumption that nothing unusual was happening behind closed doors. From a national standpoint, the operation demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated federal action when intelligence sharing, long-term surveillance, and precise execution align. The simultaneous strikes across multiple cities showed how integrated enforcement can fracture an entire operational cell in a single morning. Public statements from agencies including the FBI and ICE underscored why such coordination is essential. Fragmented enforcement allows adaptive networks time to recover. Comprehensive action denies that window. In that sense, the Georgia raids stand as a clear example of how modern law enforcement counters modern transnational threats, not with isolated arrests, but with synchronized disruption aimed at the system itself. At the same time, the case exposed an uncomfortable reality. Networks like this are engineered for survival. History shows that when one corridor is shut down, another often activates. When one cell collapses, others reorganize. Under new leadership, adapting with lessons learned from previous disruptions. Federal analysts have consistently warned that cartel structures are flexible by design. They compartmentalize, they decentralize, they rebuild. Tactical success does not automatically eliminate the broader ecosystem that sustains them. That is why officials describe the outcome carefully. It was called a major blow, not a final victory. The seizure of fentanyl, weapons, and cash undeniably prevented harm. Public health data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention continues to show that fentanyl remains the leading cause of overdose deaths among Americans aged 18 to 45. Every shipment intercepted represents lives that will never reach an emergency room. Yet those same statistics underline the scale of the broader flow. Strategically, the Georgia operation reinforced a shift in how the United States frames the threat. It is no longer viewed solely as a border issue or a localized enforcement matter. It is approached as a domestic security challenge involving foreign criminal enterprises exploiting infrastructure, housing markets, financial systems, and everyday anonymity. That explains the intensity, the coordination, the scale of federal deployment. But as the headlines fade, one question remains. If a fortified logistics node, complete with counterfeit pills, heavy weapons, and structured financial routing, can operate inside a suburban neighborhood without immediate detection, how many similar nodes remain active elsewhere? That question is not about fear. It is about vigilance. What happened in Georgia was not just a raid. It was exposure, a glimpse into how modern criminal systems embed themselves quietly and operate in plain sight. This is State Tone. If you value direct, fact-driven breakdowns of federal operations and emerging national security threats, make sure you're subscribed. Share your perspective in the comments. Do you see this as a contained disruption or part of a larger structural shift in how these networks operate? The next development may not come from a border crossing. It may come from a neighborhood that looks exactly like yours.